All right, welcome back to another episode of our podcast today. My name is David Levine of HealthTech Solutions, and today I have Ed with ES3 Solutions joining us. Ed, I'd like to welcome you.
Thank you very much.
So I just want to start out, give you the floor, just tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll get into today's topic.
Appreciate it. I have been in and around the pharmaceutical medical device business for about 35 years now, working for everything from very, very small to multinational organizations, predominantly in the quality world, working with these companies to either get products to market, to train people to develop quality management systems, and then to work with them if there happens to be any issues that arise. And those issues can be everything from manufacturing and regulatory type issues to customer related issues.
All right, awesome. And so, as I mentioned earlier to you, but just for everyone else who is watching this, our topic today is around rethinking operational efficiency, a tech focused approach to healthcare management. And so, you've actually mentioned this a little bit, but you've said you've worked extensively with compliance and quality systems from research also across healthcare and life sciences. But can you tell me from your perspective, how can technology play a role in improving operational efficiency without compromising compliance?
I think there's more and more opportunities every day, and I think it's going to continue to grow. Leveraging any sort of technology, we can start to get into understanding. I mean, something as simple as data trend analysis or being able to really examine processes to understand, do we have problems? Do we have any sort of patterns that are developing? And allow us to really kind of understand that. It can take a look at processes and understand. I mean, some of the things I've used it for is even understanding how we can create some efficiencies with it. You can see how processes end up becoming burdened or delayed or, just some basic issues. And a lot of this is trying to make things as simple as possible. Part of my approach is that the reason we need to be doing things, and this may sound kind of counterintuitive to a quality consultant, but we need to make sure that all of the items that we're putting in place become value add for the organization. And so if we're just creating bureaucracy to create bureaucracy, it doesn't work. And in cases of looking at systems, looking at technology, what can we do to leverage things so that people will see the advantage to them, see the value to them, which now makes it more of a common practice, and they're more willing to accept it than, the old scribble the notes down and have to go from there.
All right. So your organization, ES3 Solutions, has a focus on practical and sustainable compliance solutions. Can you share how your approach helps healthcare organizations maintain long-term improvements rather than short-term fixes?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. It's understanding that real value add to an organization. We've all been in that situation where we have to do something and we don't understand why. We don't see that information is being used somewhere, or we think it's an easier way of doing it. We have an easier way of doing it. As people start to buy into things, they end up being more open to doing it. A very good example is in several of the systems that I've implemented. I tell people we're going to change what you're doing, do it my way for 30 days, 60 days, whatever we can afford. And at the end of it, let's go back and reevaluate it and see, does it make sense? And if not, we'll change it back. What you tend to find is that by gaining the input from the people that are doing the work, that all of a sudden come that review period, they like the way that it's happening. It's really taking their ideas and kind of bringing them to reality. And so while, like I said, a lot of times in this industry and across the board in all of life sciences, what you end up with is, we have to do things according to the regulations. I've never once in my life seen a set of regulations that tell you how to do things. They just tell you what the ultimate goal is. A very good example being in the medical device or the pharmaceutical side, having to collect complaint information. It's pretty standard practice in the industry, and people start looking at doing this. But, how do we have an easy way of doing it so that we're sure that they're collecting the right information, so that information is being used by the organization to actually help? And then understanding that it's not in isolation, that it's got to feed back into itself. So on the medical device side, complaint information should feed back into our manufacturing process. It should feed back into our design process. It should feed into our sales process so that we understand how these things are impacting the entire organization.
I like that. So it's really about having a balance and not just doing something just for the sake of doing it, but giving it a valid reason.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And throughout my career, I'm a lead auditor. I have been auditing since the late 90s. And as I go in and start to look at organizations, those are the kind of questions that I ask. I come back and obviously you have to follow the regulations as an auditor. You're trying to see, are they meeting the intent? But I stop the audits a lot of times to have those discussions of how are we meeting exactly, as I said, the intent of the regulations, and is it something that actually makes sense? And a lot of times what you find is that organizations say, well, we do this because we have to, and we're filling everything out in triplicate and filing it in 3 different locations. And it's like, that, why is it practical? Or why do you think it's practical to do that? Well, that's what the regulations say. And I go back to those regulations often and then say, where does it say to do that? Most of the time what we get, well, that's the way we've always done it. Of course, I have to be a little bit of a little sarcastic at that point and ask them if they're still using stone tablets, if they're still using quills and parchment paper. And people go, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, exactly. We have to change with the times. We have to change with our business needs, and businesses change. That's the only constant we have, is that your business is going to change, and probably every day.
I would wholeheartedly agree. And I can just say from my experience, I'm going through that right now with my own business. There's a lot of stuff we're changing to kind of keep up, stay with the times, get stuff that works better. So I would even say this for anyone who catches this. This is a great little snippet here. Don't just change for the sake of change, but meaningful change and to move your business forward. And, things are always going to change. So I do want to really highlight that for business, because I do know a lot of people that are so like anti-change because they're afraid of something new, but it can be a good thing.
But at the end of the day, I always argue that people will come back and say that, well, everyone's afraid of change. I don't think we are. One of the questions that I've asked regularly in training is, if you could go back in your life and change one thing, no matter how big or how small it is there anyone here who wouldn't take advantage of that? And over the 35 years that I've been doing this, I've had 2 people in the entire time say, nope, wouldn't change anything because it's who made me who I am. And I said, okay, so if you're all willing to change at least something, you're not afraid of change. You're afraid of how change will negatively impact you. And that, I think, is really the key driver here, is that we have to figure out there are times where, yes, the change is going to add 10 minutes of work or a half hour of work or whatever it is. But if people understand why, if people understand what the implication of it is, and ultimately, if you get their input on how to construct the process, what they end up seeing is that there is value to it, and they're usually more receptive to change. It's not easy. I mean, no one will come back and say that change is easy. But at least people, if they understand why they're doing something, what the value of it is, I find more times than not, they at least are open to it. And they're open to keeping that change going as a normal habit.
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate that insight. So I want to move on, a little more of a personal question for you, because I know you have quite the extensive background and experience. So I want to ask, what do you enjoy most about the work you're currently doing through your company, ES3 Solutions?
It's a real simple answer. It is helping organizations to go in and provide a different perspective, to provide my expertise into these organizations. It kind of goes back to where I was mentioning earlier. This is the way we've always done it. And people tend to have the blinders on, and to be able to go in and you see the aha moment or the light bulb moment above their head when they realize there's other ways to do things and more practical ways of doing things. And so I have seen, like I said, everything from a very, very basic startup, rudimentary things that you would not really even think of as medical device, all the way up to life-saving and life-sustaining devices. And you always are able to look at it and find that there are ways to do this and to help companies be successful. And I think that a lot of that starts with helping employees become successful. If they're enjoying coming to work, if they're enjoying what they're doing because they're not having to deal with the bureaucracy or the mundane, a lot of times you can see significant changes in those organizations. And that's what we strive to do.
Perfect. And are there any current initiatives or projects that you're especially excited about right now in your organization?
It's ongoing. I have been back and forth in how I've been working with either other organizations, my own set of clients. And right now it's building this organization, the ES3 Solutions, as a maybe to get the information out there to make sure that people know where it's at. I've worked for some big firms in the past. And one of the things I see is that those big firms have that corporate mentality. They have the one size fits all. They have a pricing structure that most organizations can't really afford long term. And so creating those partnerships and knowing that, you know what, I used to work for the big ones. Now I'm smaller. I have a little more flexibility. Those are the kind of things that, and it's really just in creating. It's what I do is enjoy that. Our initiatives are just to start working with more and more companies that will allow us to kind of get that message out there and get people out of the normal rut of, oh, let's bring somebody in, let's look at this one process, let's fix it. And then we've got 10 other holes across our organization. So part of that is, and a lot of this would be internal development things. I say very standardized ways, tools that we can use, but we can also then leverage that with our clients that they may be able to use those tools on an ongoing basis for audits, for compliance, for process improvement, all of those kind of things.
And as healthcare organizations are continuing to modernize their systems, how do you see technology, especially around data security and process automation, impacting compliance and operational goals?
There's going to be impact. If we really think about the last 4 or 5 years ago, nobody even knew what AI meant, or it was a very small group. And now all of a sudden we've got machines that are learning. We've got every capability for security breaches. So how are we actively designing our processes so that we don't have as much of a concern? We don't have a liability that's there, I think is important. And I only think it's going to get worse. I think in working with companies that design things, one of the first things that we do in our planning stage is take a look at and designing a new product would be, have you thought about cybersecurity? Have you thought about the risks of the interoperability of products? I actually have working on my team what I would consider an expert in the software side of things. And it's leaning on individuals like that. It's making sure too that what we're doing is we're protecting the organization. And so some of it is designing processes that allow people, again, to be more efficient. But the other side is to allow people a sense of comfort in the security side of it, to know, we're all patients. And the last thing that I want to do is walk in and have my information compromised. And so, I tell the story regularly of, I have 2 grown adult children now. They were both very active in sports. We walked into an emergency room with one of them, and there was a product that I had been involved in directly. So we're all patients, and we have to think from that perspective. That it changed my view almost immediately, because I realized, wait a minute, the product quality, the integrity of it, all of those kind of things became extremely important, because that could be, again, it could be my family, but it's definitely somebody else's family. And so we want to be very cognizant of it.
No, that's a great point because I've spoken. I have quite a background in working in the healthcare space myself from an IT perspective. Majority of people that I've spoken with over the years don't necessarily have the same mindset or approach that what I'm hearing from you, which I really do appreciate. And it is very important, especially this day and age. And actually, someone said something very interesting the other day where he was talking about going to his clients and say, go back and actually ask your vendors how many of them are using AI and come back and tell me if any of them aren't. I'd be very surprised. And a lot of them thought, well, no, we don't use AI at all. And then they came back like gobsmacked that, yeah, they actually had AI in the stuff they were using and just weren't aware. So I think it's very key that everyone is fully aware of what they're using and what its capabilities and what it has, because, we're seeing more and more events out there that are impacting through, the supply chain across different organizations. And so we're very interconnected, and it's important, I think, for any organization to understand that it's not just us, but it's who's around us.
Absolutely. And I will tell you, I know firsthand the regulators are starting to look at it so much more in depth. I've talked to 2 companies officially, one company kind of off the record, that have submitted things for FDA for approval. And they got responses back that talked about machine learning. And they're like, our product does not have machine learning in it. And trying to be able to convince the regulators that it doesn't have it in there is becoming more and more difficult, because as you said, we don't even realize in some cases where that's happening. And so these people have, had to go through painstaking efforts to really demonstrate now that it doesn't have it, versus a few years ago where you would have to try and explain to FDA or any of the global regulators what AI is. And half the time I always say we always had a difficult time spelling AI a few years ago, and now we all live it.
Yeah. It's amazing how things progress. So I also want to ask, because I know you've talked a lot about compliance and things. So we know many practices do rely on multiple systems for compliance tracking and documentation. So what challenges do you see around protecting that data and ensuring those systems are secure? I know we've probably touched on this a little bit, but I do want to dive a little more into that.
Yeah, I hate to say this something that's non-technical to answer that question, but it's a lot of it is common sense. Things like how do we leave units? How do we have units that are secured? And I'm speaking more in the physical sense than I am in the electronic sense, but anything can be breached nowadays. So what it really comes down to is it comes down to what is your plan on how you're going to handle that. I mean, I read not too long ago, things like the smart thermostats in our homes are a very easy entryway if somebody really wants to crack into that. We all have our phones. We have our how many different devices in your house that could be actually accessed. And it's the same thing in a business. So companies understanding that this is and I keep using the term liability, but at the end of the day, something as simple as somebody getting into your systems or compromising your systems can be catastrophic for a business. I always hear about, well, what's the cost of quality? What's the cost of not having quality? And I go back and I say that it is common sense business versus it being regulatory driven. And, you don't want your products to go out there and harm somebody. You don't want your products to be losing information. Things like that, all of a sudden your name gets out there the wrong way, and it will absolutely destroy your business. So if I'm the CEO, I don't care that the regulations talk about cybersecurity or things along those lines. What I care about is if we have a problem, how is it going to affect our patients, our users? And at the same time, then what's that going to do to the brand name? It takes a lifetime to build a brand. It takes a day on the news to destroy a brand. And so I think a lot of it is in making sure that people understand those practices and understand what they have to do. And then as we design systems, we've got to be as smart as we can. There's always someone smarter. I remember back in the days, and this shows my age, unfortunately, when the internet was really getting up and running. The White House website was hacked. Well, I would assume that you've got some really smart people working on that kind of website and the security that would be there and things like that. Somebody else found another way in. And so it doesn't matter how hard we do this. We've got to be diligent about it, and it's a constant. So that's where we try and push when it comes to systems.
No, and that's perfect. No, and I would agree because I know you mentioned the word liability, and I would say right now because of all the trainings I've gone through lately, the one thing I've heard consistently with the vendors that we work with is yes, liability is king because that's really what's driving everything these days. And yes, even though that we focus more from the cyber aspect of it, but really there's overall when it comes to compliance in general that we're talking about, you've kind of got like three pieces. You have your administrative controls, like you're talking about the policies and all of those you got to have in your procedures. You've mentioned the physical, and there's also the technical.
Mhm.
And it's all these things that have to work in tandem together, and you have a nice, robust. So, and that's kind of just another thing, just making sure businesses truly understand that you've got to get all these pieces in place. So you do have that protection. And it really is these days about being as proactive as you can. And yes, it is important to determine what's our plan of action going to be, not if, but when something happens. But what can we do to minimize or prevent as much of that as possible is the approach I believe businesses should be taking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think ignorance is not bliss here. We have to be constantly learning. We have to be constantly thinking. It's a battle that'll never end. And I used the term liability earlier. Within the healthcare sector, they're using more the term risk. And we have to understand. I use the term liability because, unfortunately, being based in the U.S., we're a litigious society, and people do understand that. Oh, wait, when you say liability, they start thinking about dollar signs. The reality is that liability, in my perspective, is patient care, is patient life, is patient well-being. And so we have to really think about that, and we've got to be able to proactively work on those kind of things. Again, I'm speaking from the perspective of a medical device, but I've got a very, very close friend who's a doctor, and I laughed. I said, I could come in and I said, I can do the exact same work that I'm doing with a manufacturer that I do with a hospital. And he said, no, you can't. He said, it's very different. And I said, no. I said, if we flow chart it out, I said, essentially what I do is I look at processes. Where's the inefficiency in processes? Where can we make them better? And I said, yours, most of them have a box. It has an arrow that comes in and it has an arrow that says out. I said, the only difference is I said, you have two arrows that come out. I said, one is the patient goes home. Number two, the patient goes downstairs and doesn't make it out of the hospital. I said, but it's something comes in, you're adding value to it, and then you have an output. And so by doing it process-based, it really does translate across industries in being able to look at this. And so it's, again, as I push it, kind of comes back to that common sense. What do I want to know as a CEO to guide my organization to make sure my organization is doing things right? And that's where we start everything. You want to have procedures so that we're doing things exactly the same every time. You want to make sure that we have design controls in place so we're developing a safe and effective product. You want to make sure that we have the documentation and the records on the back end to make sure if there's any questions that we've answered those. You want to make sure that complaints are handled. You want to make sure that if we have a problem, we have a corrective action in place. So, there are things that could work for any business that's out there. If we put the business sense on it, what we start to realize is that this is things that instead of looking at as a cost of quality, it's starting to look at as a driver of bottom line.
I wholeheartedly agree. I find this very fascinating, so I do appreciate it. Just want to see if, before we wrap, if you had any final thoughts or any thing else you'd like to share.
I think as we continue to change, or as not change, but as business evolves, as technology evolves, as the workplace evolves, I mean, the one thing I can look at is that we've just got to be diligent in making sure that we're always going back. It can't always be this is the way we've done it. We've got to be openly accept change. I had a boss many years ago that during my first review, he said, "How many times have you failed in the last quarter?" And I said, "None." And he marked me down on my review for it. He said, "We have to learn by making mistakes, but then we have to go back and fix those mistakes, and we have to not make them again." And I think it's the same thing when we start looking at a business. We're going to make mistakes. But how do we sit down and do the planning? How do we sit down and understand if this doesn't work, what's our mitigation for it? And a lot of the systems that my organization puts in, we always talk about, let's get this 80% correct. Let's get it into place. Let's start to run it. And then we realize the specific nuances for an organization. And you have to then make those changes based on the organizations. It's a never ending battle, but it's one of those that's very manageable if you take the time to do it right.
Well, thank you. Phenomenal information. I do appreciate you for coming to share. For anyone who's interested or like to learn more, in the description below the video, we'll have ways you can reach out and get in touch with Ed and his organization if this you find of value and would like some more information.
I appreciate it.